Hi everybody, my name is Scott Killeen from Kelp Creative. I'm here today to talk to you about heritage interpretation. First of all, I want to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which I'm presenting, and that's the Wurundjeri Wurrung people here in the Kulin Nation in Victoria. So what is heritage interpretation? Well, before I talk about that, let me talk to you about why Kelp. I mentioned I'm from Kelp Creative. And Kelp Creative is my consultancy company. I've been consulting for a few years, focused very much on visitor experience and interpretation and planning. But my background's a little bit mixed. So I started off a few years ago at Melbourne Zoo. I was general manager of visitor experiences there for about 15 years. And prior to that, I looked after visitor experiences at Museum Victoria, hence the dinosaurs on the bottom of the screen. And prior to that, I studied natural and cultural heritage interpretation here at Deakin University. But now I'm focusing very much on helping people craft stories that share experiences and meaningful products. And so the idea of Kelp Creative is the idea that kelp, if you know anything about kelp grows best when it's anchored to rock. And it's the idea of an experience works best when anchored to purpose, which is a nice link into what interpretation is. So for many people, interpretation is this stuff, lots of signs. Of course, signs come in lots of different shapes and sizes. In fact, one day I'm convinced I'm going to write a PhD on what a sign actually is. But of course, it's not all about signs. A little story, I used to work with a colleague who used to introduce themselves as a person who looked after interpretation. And I remember one time someone would say to them, so you look after signs. And they calmly, very calmly explained what they did and that their role included signs, but it wasn't all about signs. Because what they really wanted to do was reach across the table, grab the person, shake them, and say, it's not all about signs. Of course, interpretive media includes other things like audio devices, face-to-face interpretation, apps, AR, VR, interactives, sculpture, media, displays and exhibits, play, sculpture, games, nature play, performances, tracks and trails, and even facilities. Even going to the toilet can be interpretive. But of course, all of those things are the what? They're the interpretive media. Interpretation, though, is more about the why. So interpretive media, sometimes it's like putting the cart before the horse. It's a bit hard to work out exactly how you're going to tell your story if you don't know what your story is about or the why. So just to explore that a little bit further, let's step back to where it all began. Now, of course, our First Nations people have been telling stories for tens of thousands of years. When you think about the interpretation that we think of, it started with this fellow, considered to be the grandfather of interpretation, Freeman Tilden. And he wrote a series of principles in this book, Interpreting Our Heritage, based in the national park movements. So really, interpretation as we know it today, as we think about it in this context, really came from the practice of interpreting or translating natural landscapes, both their natural and cultural heritage aspects, into ways that people could better understand and better connect with. Interpretation Australia, the peak body for interpretation, defines interps as communicating ideas, information, and knowledge in a way which helps visitors to make sense of their environment. So good interpretation will create engaging, unique, and meaningful experiences for visitors. So it's not just about information, it's about how do we help people create meaning within spaces or products or experiences. So it's really all about being anchored to purpose. So think about what is that experience, what's really at the core or the kernel of the experience or the product that you're creating, and what's its story and how do you share that? So as I said, it's really all about storytelling. Now, why that's so important, I love this little diagram. Our brains are actually wired for storytelling. Like I said, we've been people have been telling stories for tens of thousands of years, and our brain responds really quite differently. So on one side of the screen, you can see where the brain's activating in just two locations. That's our brain when we're listening to facts and figures. On the other side, that's how our brain responds when we're listening to stories. So you can see many more parts of the brain are activated. And in fact, what that does is produce a whole lot of other hormones in our brains. It actually helps the way that we remember things. So we remember things with more clarity and more depth and more richness when we listen to a story. So that's interpretation. Well, then what's heritage interpretation? Oh, I'm glad you asked. So heritage interpretation, of course, heritage can be natural, cultural, tangible, or intangible. So what that means is really heritage interpretation is just another way of saying interpretation. In fact, overseas, the word or the term heritage interpretation is used probably more broadly than it is here. The challenge in Australia is that the term heritage interpretation has become quite linked and quite synonymous with built heritage. So as we've talked about already, interpretation is really the natural and cultural heritage of any site or place. And good interpretation will always consider all of those opportunities and all of those stories. Recently in Australia, it's become a little bit confused. And so to combat that confusion, that you'll see the term more likely interpretation being used more broadly within Australia rather than heritage interpretation. So for instance, our association is called Interpretation Australia, not Heritage Interpretation Australia. And really one of those main reasons is to try and illustrate the fact that interpretation or heritage interpretation is really both natural and cultural in its focus. So interpretive planning, let's chat a little bit about that. This idea of being story-led and experience-driven is a term I love. I did because I wrote it, but it's really about this idea of how do you drive a plan. Now, the plan depends on the scale of the project you're working on. So don't let this go, oh my gosh, my projects are too small for this. It's small or big. The plan really responds to that. But in essence, it's the same. We think about the vision, whether you're thinking about a site that you might be working on or a particular project. So what's its real purpose? What's the vision? And then the site itself, if it's a site, it might be a product or an experience or a person or a place. And then the visitors that you're engaging. So thinking about each of those as key sort of drivers. And then the overlap between those two, the spaces between are also really interesting. So between vision and site, we have the narrative. And we'll talk more about that in a second. So they're the key ingredients of your plan. The area between the site and the visitors, they're the facilities. So like we said before, even going to the toilet can be interpretive. And then the overlap between the vision and the visitors, that's all the experiences that you craft. And all of those work together to create your interpretive plan. Like I said, if you've got a large project, we'll talk about one of those in a little while, you might have multiple sites, you might have a complex plan based on something like this. But if you're working on a singular experience, you might have a simple little table that says, well, you know, what's my purpose? What's my narrative? And we'll go through that now. So let's talk about the narrative and break that down. So for me, a narrative has these key ingredients. So a theme, a set of guiding principles so that you know you're on the right track. A bit of personality, so defines interpretation that you're looking for in the interpretive media and what helps to define which media might suit your site or your style of presenting or whatever it may be. And then the series storylines that you use as a basis for those interpretive media. So let's start with theme. So theme, just like a costume party, I'm sure many of you will have been to a costume party at some point. And really a theme at a party is just a way of narrowing down the choices that you would have to dress up and costumes. So rather than having every single possibility in mind, it narrows it all the way down to 60s or 70s or some other weird ones that I'm sure you've been to. So a theme for interpretation works much the same way. It's a single idea to organize the information and experiences. And the key thing about this is it helps to decide what you include and, more importantly, what you leave out. Years ago, I was running theme workshops with a group of people, and halfway through, I went across to someone who was looking quite perplexed. And I said, are you okay? And they went, yeah. And they said, but are you saying that with a theme, we don't have to include everything? I went, no, that's the point. It just helps you work out what your focus is going to be. And there was just a sense of relief that this person who knew quite a lot of information was relieved that they didn't have to include all of that in that one little talk that they were preparing. So a theme, whether you call it a theme or a key message or the moral of the story, leave that up to you. But the intent's the same. It's thinking about what the core intent of that experience or product is, and then using that as a basis or the anchor for the interpretation and the experience you develop. A couple of examples for Wirrabee Yallock, which is a river near where I live. This idea of safeguarding the future of Wirrabee Yallock or the Wirrabee River. It must flow through people's hearts just as it does the landscape. So it's an example of talking about the natural landscape, but also its impact on people. So quite an emotional component. And interpretation is often quite emotional. So moving from the idea it's not just information, but what's that sense of meaning about that place and what's its sense of purpose. Another example, Victorians' love for the coast is its greatest threat, but also its greatest hope. So talking about the challenge that people have in wanting to explore the coast, the issues that has around conflict with wildlife, pollution, all those things, but also that desire to explore the coast is the same idea that would lead to its protection. So, tips for making interpretation as engaging as possible. A couple of ideas for you to think about as we go through. So, challenge yourself. Talked about interpretive media, talked about signs and AR and all sorts of things. One of the tricks I think is to always try something new. If you might be used to a particular type of media, maybe you're focused very much on signage, maybe you're focused on sort of tours or leaflets or pamphlets, whatever it may be, but how do you challenge yourself? This was one I did at Zoos Victoria when I worked there. One of the objectives was try and help people be better aware of this little endangered frog. Crabby frogs are about the size of your fingernail, a bit bigger, border of Victoria and New South Wales, highly endangered. And so rather than just creating, we had these little sculptures you see in the foreground. We did those in the first instance. That got some engagement, but we got from research not much more recall in terms of remembering the species name. So we created the thing behind it, which was a frog disco. Worked with the Wiggles. They had a song called the Crabby Frog. So inside there's this digital dance floor, giant Crabby Frog on top. As a result of that, we had 26% more people remember that frog as coming through. So example of being a little bit out of the box. Element of surprise always works, using surprise as a hook to really grab people's attention when they're not expecting something, often more engaging. This is a project up in Brisbane with the Brisbane Environment Centres. They were wanting to engage people more along this mudflats area where they were originally allowed to have dogs off leash and moving to a leash, dogs on leash area. And so they set up this little dining table to demonstrate and interpret that the mudflats is actually a home. They might think about it as a place to walk the dog and a place of leisure, but it's actually a home for these native birds. So they set up a dining table. It's in the middle of the mudflats, and people would come over and go, "What is this about?" And so it really hooked people in so they could have that conversation about dogs and birds. Build a toolkit. So as you go, as you're experimenting, try new things, don't throw them away, keep them to the side. Whether it's a physical toolkit you build like this one, which is a community conservation toolkit at Zoos Victoria, or whether it's a metaphorical one. But the idea is, experiment, try, and if it doesn't work the first time, don't throw it away, keep it for a rainy day and try it again another time. And be brave. This is one of my favorite characters at Hillsville Sanctuary, Crap Man. It was a campaign that Zoos was running around using recycled toilet paper, as in toilet paper made from recycled paper, not toilet paper used twice. But Crap Man was a great character. Lots of controversy over having a person walking around the zoo called Crap Man, but he was great. And I think he just really symbolized that idea of just being brave and trying something new. And I said another idea, sometimes you get a sense of, you've got to have big budgets to do big ideas means big budgets. And it doesn't always. This is a lovely little story from a local cafe, Mary Lou's Cafe. And when they were opening up, they just really wanted to share their story with people about what they do. And it's, the way we did it is in chatting to them, talking about what they do and why they do, again, finding out that sort of that core, that kernel. And it was that idea that really they do it because food brings them together. They do it at home with family and they do it in the community. There's a little panel there that just tells their story, and lots of people come in and engage with that, and it's a good conversation starter. But again, really simple, really small in budget, but just a real clear idea and delivered well. Now, if you need some help, thoughts, guidance, talk to like-minded people, have a chat to the folks in Interpretation Australia. As it's a key body within Australia. They're also a gateway to similar organisations around the world. In fact, they're part of the Global Alliance for Interpretation. Website's there, and certainly the links will be available. Certainly a great resource to check out and just continue on your interpretive journey. And really, the key thing just to remind, we'll take a look at a couple of examples in a second, but this idea of being story-led and experience-driven really makes a difference, I believe. And I'm just going to give you a quick example of how that works. So this one example, Bass Coast here in Victoria, Bass Coast Shire Council, working on a trail, Dinosaur's Trail. And the really interesting thing about that, if you're familiar with that part of coast, down near Phillip Island, between San Remo and Inverloch, it has the world's most unique polar dinosaurs, strangely enough, but it's true. It's also the site of Australia's first dinosaur fossil that was found in the early 1900s, and a really interesting site. But again, probably not anything you would know from looking at the coastline. But in going through this process, starting off with the theme, and you can see the theme there up at the top, which is this idea that exploring polar dinosaurs along Victoria's Bass Coast reveals layers of stories fueled by 40 years of groundbreaking discoveries and the dinosaur dreamers who search for dinosaurs, but ultimately search for the lessons dinosaurs can teach us about our future. So theme, core idea, a series of principles. We mentioned principles before. You can see those there. Things like discovery, the hero dinosaurs, curated, being a launch pad, all those sorts of things. And then a series of sites. So in this case, are those five sites, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sites across there from Inverloch to San Remo. Each of those has a unique story. So for example, at Inverloch, Science, Art and Imagination really talks about the science that underpins dinosaur hunting. Whereas at Caves, it's about the passion and perseverance, which is the idea that rather than focusing on the dinosaurs themselves, we actually wouldn't know anything about those dinosaurs without the people that have made those discoveries. So that site, that piece of the puzzle, if you will, really focuses on the people behind those stories. Whereas, for example, Kilcunda is about the forces of nature and time. It's about those environmental forces that shape the coast, but also have preserved and now exposing those fossils. Then each one of those sites has its own personality. So if we think about Inverloch again, that little adventure playground, it's imaginative, playful and sensory. Whereas the Caves, which is about passion and perseverance, is about human, intimate and reflective. And so the interpretive media, we work with a number of artists who have developed these concepts that responded to that. So the idea of imaginative, playful and sensory is an adventure playground, whereas human, intimate and reflective at the Caves is a stop animation. So I'm just going to flick across to another screen so we can have a look at what that looks like in the flesh. So I'm going to jump onto a website that was developed to really help promote that idea and really demonstrate what the concept was about. And we'll just grab up that website now. So this is a website you can sort of jump on and have a look at the Bass Coast dinosaurs, jump on and have a look. I'll just show you a couple of those sites that we mentioned. So if we come across to Inverloch. So Inverloch was at Dinosaur Hunters Playground, and we talked about the fun and playful and imaginative. And you can sort of see these concepts here and see how the text that was developed. So remember, these are at concept stage. Council's now looking for funding to deliver these. And each of those responds back to that interpretive narrative that was developed. So this idea of, what it's like to discover a fossil. They're the discoveries that await dinosaur hunters. So again, what's the science that underpins those? The whole playground was developed based on those same concepts and ideas. And you can see the storyline there of science, art and imagination that we know, basically what we know based on 40 years of research. So the idea of that research really underpins that site. And then if we have a look at, let's have a look at the Caves. So the Caves, that was the idea of the people behind those discoveries. So this was the artist's interpretation of that, which I just love, called Pocket Paleontologists. And so it's the idea of the little stop animation characters based on each, a number of the scientists working on the project. So again, digital dinosaur hunters. So again, you can see how that relates back to the interpretive narrative. And then these are some of the characters. So run down a bit further. So Jake, Jake's a paleontologist. He's doing his PhD in what are called megaraptors, which are giant dinosaurs. Well, giant, they're about the size of a horse. Down here, unlike other places in Australia, we didn't get giant dinosaurs. But Jake is focused very much on these meat-eating dinosaurs. He just loves them. But again, and Mike is a prospector. Mike spent much of his life down along the coast finding dinosaurs, and he was a key driver behind the whole Dinosaurs Trail. So both those characters, and there's another one, I think Leslie was further up. If I scoot back, Leslie will come up in a second. Leslie calls, there she is. So Leslie, her favorite animal's not a dinosaur, actually, it's a turtle. So she got a turtle character. But it's really that whole idea of, in this case, the story identified there was about the people and the passion and perseverance it takes to take, and you can see how that's been delivered. So this is an example of a large scale project, but you can see how it could be a trail that has a multiple series of points along the way. They might be small sites. It might be a single site, but how the idea from a really well-conceived narrative creates that blueprint to deliver sort of great interpretive experiences. So for me, I hope you enjoyed those. I really just wanted to provide a bit of an overview of interpretation and heritage interpretation, and the sort of planning process, and the idea that being story-led and experience-driven can make a difference. Thanks for your time.